Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. After a quick break, we are entering into the very first keynote session, KS1, the Global Risk Agenda and Uncovering Resilience Strategies. So I'd like to welcome the session moderator for this very first technical session, Dr. Indrajit Pal, Assistant Professor, DPMM, AIT, Thailand. So please help me in welcoming.
Thank you, Nishma. So, welcome to the first keynote session. It's a very interesting one. I'd like to invite our session chair, Professor Rajeev Shah. So, Professor Rajeev Shah is a professor in Kyoto University, Japan. At present, is also co-founder of a Delhi-based organization called RICA, Resilience Innovation Knowledge Academy, and also chair of the board of two Japanese non-governmental agencies, SEEDS Asia and CWS Japan. He's also co-chair of Asia Pacific Science Technology Academic Advisory Group and CLA for IPCC 6 assessment report. Professor Shah having 52 books and more than 400 research papers in the field of environment, disaster management, and climate change. The website address is there. We'll also copy that website address for more detail for Professor Shah. Professor Rajeev Shah, welcome to the keynote session. We have two distinguished keynote speakers. I'd like to hand over the floor to Professor Rajeev Shah to take it further. Thank you. Welcome, Professor Rajeev Shah.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Indrajit, and a very good afternoon from Japan. Good morning to some other parts of Asia, and I see some people also beyond Asia, so possibly good morning, good afternoon, good evening, including everything. So thank you very much for joining. I remember that when I was discussing this particular event with Indrajit back in last year, maybe September, October, November, and that time we were too naive. We thought that maybe if we do it in June, possibly the COVID situation will be much better. And then maybe we can have a face-to-face conference. And we were really, really too naive to understand the complexity of the current pandemic and this all the new variant and everything what is happening. So I think there are both negative side and positive side of it. We missed Bangkok delicacies. We missed the face-to-face participation. But on the positive side, I see that there have been an immense participation from lots of young professionals. Usually, you know that in the international conference, we meet the same people, we say just hello, and then half of the time we don't be in the conference, go somewhere else and do some other chatting. But here I see that out of the technical sessions, there are lots of PhD students, the early career researchers, and that's, I think, a very, very important part. And that's possibly the strength of this particular conference. And my sincere congratulations to Indrajit and all the team members who have been working very, very hard for this. Actually, I was counting the logos. Indrajit, do you know how many logos you have put? 22 logos. 22, I was counting, 22 logos. And 3 keynote, 20 technical sessions. So 200 papers. It's a huge work, actually. And I can imagine that all your team members have been spending so much of time for this. So I think we are really privileged to be part of this particular conference. And out of 22 logo, actually, I represent 5 of them. So coming to this topic, when you talk about the disaster risk reduction or disaster resilience and sustainable development, means linking resilience with sustainable development, it actually broadens our scope. And 2015 was possibly that landmark year where the SDGs, Sendai Framework, Paris Agreement, New Urban Agenda, all these global frameworks had lots of cross-cutting interrelationship. And when we have this particular linkage on resilience and sustainable development, we see, of course, very high-level participation from the government, also from the private sector. But today, you saw the AIT president mentioning about different types of ranking of SDGs of the university. And this is a new trend actually, that the university also recognize different types of contribution related to the SDG. And that gives us also possibly open up some new window to do some new innovation, some actual field work, and then try to possibly conduct some specific research with the local communities and so on. So I think that's a very, very new and very encouraging trend, I will say, that the university top administrations recognize the importance of the SDG and related to the resilience-related research. And in this particular keynote, our starting point would be no other than Professor Takeuchi, whom many of you know as one of the most respected, well-known figure in the field of environment, disaster, resilience, sustainable development. Professor Takeuchi had his higher degrees on agriculture from University of Tokyo. Then he had been an academician, a very prominent academician in University of Tokyo, but he has also served in many high-level positions. He was the Vice Rector of United Nations University. From 2019 onward, he took up a position of project professor in the Institute of Future Initiative in University of Tokyo. And he is also currently the acting chair of the Central Environmental Council, which is the top decision-making council of government of Japan related to the environment and sustainable development issue. Is also the editor-in-chief of Sustainability Science, which is one of the highest impact factor journal in this particular field. Is also the distinguished chair of Wangari Maathai Institute of Peace and Environment Studies of University of Nairobi, apart from being his main position, which is the president of IJS, Institute of Global Environmental Strategy. So we will hear a very important topic from Professor Takeuchi, which is the circulating and ecological sphere. So he will be talking about the creation of circulating and ecological sphere for attaining integrated disasters and climate resilience. Over to you, Professor Takeuchi. We are honored to have you with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rajeev Shah, my good friend, distinguished participants, particularly the President Eden Wu and Dr. Indrajit Par, and many colleagues from AIT, distinguished participants. It is my great honor to speak at the beginning of this very important symposium. Today, my talk focuses on how we could fully utilize a new concept that we developed, which is called Circulating and Ecological Sphere, which we are aiming to disseminate this idea not only in Japan, but also in other parts of the world, particularly in the Asia and Pacific. So, I would like to start my talk by understanding of the current pandemic, how we could understand the COVID-19 pandemic. Of course, there are many medical reasons, but very basically, we need to consider the inappropriate relationship between the people and wildlife. So people became too close to the habitat of wildlife, where various zoonoses are distributing. And these causes are also common to the other global challenges, such as climate change, biodiversity loss, intensification of natural disasters. And so we need to consider how we could solve these problems to improve our planetary health. Both planetary boundary and planetary health are now being integrated. Now, I would like to share with you the importance of integration, as Professor Rajeev Shah already mentioned. we have many global challenges, achievement of the SDGs, achievement of the Paris Agreement, and achievement of the Aichi biodiversity target, and necessity of continuing our efforts in the post-2020 biodiversity framework, and also the Sendai framework. All these issues are interrelated, but unfortunately, until now, most of the discussions have been made separately, and we need to integrate these efforts in order to effectively utilize our resources, both monetary resources and human resources. And we need to consider this post-COVID situation as a kind of the new opportunity. For example, already we recognize the importance of virtual meeting. And after the COVID-19 situation, we should consider about how we could best mix of the physical meeting and virtual meeting simultaneously. And also another very important issue is that not just to discuss on the global community, but we need to downscale our discussions and to find out the solutions on the ground. So one thing is to take an integrated approach, and the second is to take a local action in order to materialize our ideas. And I would like to share with you the importance of the Asia Pacific region. This figure shows that the Asia is the biggest source of the marine plastics. And in order to solve this problem, it's now becoming one of the most serious issues on the globe. So some of the scientists are expecting that within this century, the amount of the plastic will exceed than the total amount of fish, which is a catastrophic situation for us. And we need to solve these issues. And Asia is a key for solving these issues. Asia has been growing and becoming rich, but at the same time, Asia has been deteriorating in terms of the environment and also inequality issues, gender issues. These sort of issues need to be solved in the Asian context. And another important issue is that we are willing to discuss about how we could appropriately control our urban planet. Now the population in urban area is much more than in the rural areas. And insufficient situation between the supply and on the other side, the consume. So these have been differentiated. So for example, in my country, Japan, we are importing a lot of food and timbers from other part of the of the world, particularly Asia. Although we have plenty of the potential to produce the timbers, we have about 70% forested areas, and we have a rich in agriculture products. But we are abandoning of our rural areas. Why trying to import these precious resources from other parts of the world? This situation needs to be changed. And also we must recognize in the urban century that Asia occupies most of the top largest cities in the world. So out of 10 cities, 7 of them are located in Asia. And therefore, we need to consider how we could control our urban population, how we could control our urban environment, how we could strengthen the resilience against disasters in urban areas are crucial for us to further consider. We need to reconsider and maybe about our business as usual development pathway. Many people say that in Asia, population has been concentrating to the mega cities like Tokyo, Osaka, Beijing, Shanghai, Bangkok, Jakarta, and many other cities. But if you look at the current situation after the COVID-19, so if you look at the Bangkok situation, people started to move to the outside of the Bangkok. Of course, many of them will come back to Bangkok after the post COVID-19, but some of them will stay in the rural areas so that they could, by utilizing of the most advanced information technology, while continuing their job, even in the rural areas, the same job as they did in the mega cities, while trying to enjoy their life with the kids in the countryside. So this lifestyle already started. One of the very big company already decided to move the headquarters from the center of Tokyo to the island in the western part of Japan. And they, of course, asked them if they want to move, and they will prepare the housings and schools and other facilities, and so that they could try to develop their new styles. And this is a new trend that we can see all over the world. And so we are not sure either post-pandemic is just return to the previous situation, or either we will move to the different phase of our lifestyle and our social systems. So this is still unclear, but this is, I think, at least we can say, great opportunity to transform our society. And many people, including the Antonio Guterres of the UN, is insisting the importance of transformative change for us to take the sustainable pathway. But at this moment, we are still using the business as usual way of improving our situation. But this is not enough to achieve the net zero by the year 2050. So we need to do more innovative effort to transform our society. In order to do, we already developed the concept of the integrated improvement of environment, economy, and society. And this is coming from the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. And as a chair of this discussion, I try to include the spirits of the SDGs. And then we try to localize the spirits of SDGs. And also we try to include the necessity of innovation of lifestyles. Many people, when they talk about innovation, they are basically talking about technological innovation. But we are thinking that at the same time, we need to consider about the social systems innovation as well as the lifestyle innovation. And to maximize the sustainable use of local resources are crucial issues. And another crucial issue is promoting partnership. And I'm saying that the partnership is not such a traditional partnership, but I would like to say that we have a living in the globalized world. So international discussion and local discussion need to be simultaneously discussed. And therefore, we need to build a kind of the nested structure of the partnerships among us in order to meet our various challenges. This is a concept of a circulating and ecological sphere. In order to differentiate from the circular economy, which has been developed in basically in Europe and in other part of the world. It mostly focuses on the issues of material cycle. But circulating, what we think is that it also needs to consider about the circulation of energy and circulation of the CO2, carbon, decarbonized society, and resource circulation need to be coupled. This is the idea that why we try to utilize the circulating instead of a circular. But the circulating and ecological sphere, in short, we call it as a CES. So very basically, we need to secure and the safe community by adapting the ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction or ecosystem-based adaptation. And then we could create a society in harmony with nature while trying to create a link between the natural capital in rural areas as well as the produce capital in urban areas. And the interaction between the two will be a very important elements for establishment of the CES concept. And based on the natural capital, we will create the resource circulation by applying of the concept of reduce, reuse, recycle. In short, it's called 3 Rs. And then decarbonization, introducing of renewable energy sources, which is basically decentralized and locally produced, and will have some sort of the conflict with agricultural product. But we can turn it to the win-win situation. So by combining of renewable energy development with agricultural production, once we could establish such a win-win situation, and we could contribute to the revitalization of the local economy by applying of this CES concept. And of course, we are not in the closed society. We are now living in the globalized society. And therefore, the people exchange, information exchange, and the exchange of technology need to be open to the global community. Therefore, we need to connect to global communities by this aspect. But very basically, we are willing to create a decentralized systems in various countries, and also we are now willing to try to expand this idea to the Asia and the Pacific regions. This is a hierarchical structure of a CES. So from the global scale, regional scale, local scale, and community scale. When you talk about the rare metal, it is stupid to collect the rare metal on the community base. So it is very appropriate to collect the rare metals on the regional scale. So East Asia, or at least one country. But if you talk about the use of the waste for fertilizing of the agricultural land, in that case, the community level or local level will be very, very appropriate. And if you try to develop the renewable energy sources, and then the local scale will be very appropriate rather than the regional scale or community scale. So this is a kind of the hierarchical structure of the CES, and we are now trying to collect some examples from Japan, and very recently we decided to try to collaborate with the Asian countries and the Asian cities, try to develop their own CES system based on their own individual characteristics of the region, both natural and social. This is a nested structure of controlling and governing of the natural capital, as I already explained. And this nested structure will be very, very important because we are living in the globalized world. So the global discussion need to be reflected in the local scale, and local level activities could be reflected to the global scale discussion. like UN Convention on Climate Change, Biodiversity, Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, and so on. This is a conceptualized image of local circulating ecological sphere. So from the countryside, the rural areas, they can provide various ecosystem services, while from the cities, we could provide the money and also the human resources to the rural areas, and so that we could create the appropriate combination of the urban and rural areas. So this is, in other words, we call the city region. Not just to think about the future of the city, but also we need to consider about the city and associated rural areas. And this is one of the examples how we could develop concretely. This is a IGES project on Satoyama, which is a secondary nature we found in Japan as a model for the harmonious coexistence between the people and nature. And we are trying to develop this idea to the 4 regions, not just for enhancing of the relationship between the people and nature, but also fully utilize the natural resources in the locality, and so that we could fully develop the renewable energy sources, including the biomass, and could create a strong linkage between the urban and rural. And also many other components will be further developed, and we are now willing to materialize this idea on the ground. And this is our approach that we could apply to the Philippines Laguna Bay Lake by inviting over different municipalities as well as the different stakeholders in order to develop the disaster resilient participatory watershed management systems by starting from the scenario development and move to the risk assessment and identifying the countermeasures, and finally the climate resilient land use planning. So these are the kind of the concrete development that we are now trying to extend our idea to the Asian countries. Another example, how we could utilize this idea to the Thailand, which is called Udon Thani. And here you can see the urban population and surrounding the rural areas could have some sort of the interlinkages in terms of the food supply as well as the water supply. And so this is a case study that we are now trying to develop. And we are hoping that we could further collaborate with the AIT, because this area is very close to the AIT. And this is a partnership that we recently launched with START, based in the United States. And we try to develop the regional consortium and inviting of various stakeholders, not just research institutions like our institutes, but also the universities, private sectors, local municipalities, and many others, so that we could expand this concept to apply to various objectives. So I would like to ask you if you are interested to join our consortium. And this is my final slide. When I attended the Sendai conference, I insisted the importance of combining ecosystem management with climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction. And I'm still keeping this idea and try to take an integrated approach and combining of economic and sustainable measures with multiple ecosystem services and climate change biodiversity integration. All these are the basis for the disaster risk reduction that we aim to further develop. I would like to conclude that this symposium will be a great opportunity to consider about the possibility of our future development of our ideas by taking an integrated approach, as I already explained as the concept of the CES. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Takeuchi, for this excellent presentation. And lots of actually keywords you have mentioned. Instead of me making any summary, maybe it's a rare opportunity for young students to ask questions. So maybe we're a little bit over time, but maybe one quick question, short question, if there is anyone. Indrajit, how does it work? So they will unmute them and ask the question, or they will put the questions in the chat?
Yeah, I think the chat box will be a better option.
Okay, so if you have any question,
please.
In that case, maybe what I will do is that we will not possibly stop here. We will continue to the next keynote. Meanwhile, you can put your questions in the chat, and then maybe after our next speaker, we will come back to Professor Takeuchi to respond some of the questions. So thank you very much, Professor Takeuchi. With that, we go to our next speaker, Mr. Hans Gutman, who is the Executive Director of so he has over 25 years of experience on policy and development, especially in the field of rural development, water resource management, environmental management, water diplomacy, and international cooperation. He also served in many important positions in Southeast Asia. So he was the CEO of the Mekong River Commission, one of the very important and major regional body from 2011 to 2015. He supervised the implementation of the 1995 Mekong Agreement on transboundary water management. He also was the coordinator of the Wetland Alliance program, where he managed 50 agencies in 5 countries to cooperate on aquatic resource management for poverty reduction and Mekong region. So he holds a BSc from James Cook University in Australia, and you will be very happy to know he is an AIT alumni. So he did his master's from AIT. So we will hear from Mr. Gutman on the global risk agenda and uncovering resilience strategies, especially focusing on the experience of ADBC.
Greetings, avoiding morning, afternoon, and knowing that we are from different time zones, all distinguished participants, and a very great thank you to Asian Institute of Technology, AIT, for inviting Asian Disaster Preparedness Center. And as mentioned, as an AIT alumna, it's always a pleasure to engage with different events and different engagements with AIT. This is a keynote speech, so we will be followed by a lot of very detailed and professional and delving into a lot of interesting topics. So this is perhaps more setting a startup view, something to inspire, hopefully, but also perhaps be thought-provoking. And following the previous speaker, Professor Takeuchi, is obviously a hard act, but let me go about on this global risk agenda and uncovering resilience strategies by using some examples later on close to home for me, in effect what ADBC are doing in these areas, and invite you all to join us in that effort. I mean, risk and disasters are taking center stage. Back in 2019, which now seems a very long time ago, there were preparations for the big next climate summit, and the impacts of climate change was in the forefront of many people's minds at the time. And there was increasingly evidence for how climate change was manifesting itself through disasters and extreme events, fires raging everywhere, droughts and storms, etc. And then 2020 came along, and with COVID-19, I would say a giant reset occurred in many areas, and the devastating health impacts, but also perhaps even more significant, the economic hardships that all of the actions caused, and loss of livelihoods, connectivity, transport, both people and goods. And I think we're still a bit shell-shocked from those experiences. So where do we now go? Disasters are still at the forefront, and pandemics, biological disasters, are going to dominate some of the discussions for some time. But other disasters and risks have not gone away.
Excuse me, Mr. Hans, like I think
Yes?
the slide is not moving.
I'm moving to the next slide shortly.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And for example, evacuations are complicated by COVID-19. Coping capacity has been eroded through the economic hardships, etc. So I hope my slide is moving now. I mean, a lot of recent assessments and reports have been undertaken. A few are listed here. But what's interesting to a certain perspective at the higher level is that there is they're quite uniform in the outlook. Of course, COVID-19 will permeate much of the visions now, but at the forefront in many of these assessments are a couple of issues. Climate change, of course. And even when you move into looking at economic issues across the world, extreme events and disasters are up there in the top reasons for hardships in the future. Extreme events through climate change we're talking about increasing in frequency and intensity. Urbanization, another area, will putting more people at greater risk in many areas, particularly if it's not coupled with proper risk reduction. Economic vulnerability exacerbates the vulnerability to disaster impacts, etc. And although great progress has been made in various areas, such as preparedness and response, there's still a lot of additional risks that are piling up in front of us and around us. And I think it's also important just to consider that about 80% of disasters in Asia are hydrometeorological in origin and therefore are going to be affected by climate change. Now, it was mentioned earlier, we had 2015 as a watershed, many global frameworks, Agenda 2030 with the SDGs, the Sendai Framework, Paris Agreement, there's the World Humanitarian Summit, and the Global Compact related to that. The New Urban Agenda was mentioned. And as deliberated by Professor Takeuchi, a limitation is that these were all developed in parallel, but they were not integrated, they were separate. And a lot of the work that is now needed to be done is looking into some level of coherence. Particularly as highlighted in the previous presentation, when it comes down to the level of implementation at the local level, there can be a lot of confusion of trying to implementing things that at the local level are practically similar, but they're coming as directives from the different global frameworks. So you'll need to look across, and I mean, in some areas, Agenda 2030 SDGs and the Sendai Framework has done some of that work. And I think some of the work that needs continued assessment is to see how that can be taken across at the national level and then also taken down to the local level for implementation. Now, just a little bit of an overview of ADBC, since I will be highlighting some of the work that we're doing in the context of demonstrating how an organization dedicated to disaster risk reduction is operating. So ADBC is an autonomous international organization dedicated to its vision of safer communities and sustainable development through disaster risk reduction in Asia and Pacific. Established in 1986, and at that time a center actually of Asian Institute of Technology, which focused on capacity building in disaster risk management. And over the years, ADBC has then evolved and been broader in its approach, moved away from just training to other areas, and ultimately moved out of AIT. And recently, its international charter was put into effect after ratifying by the founding members, the 9 countries in Asia. And it was a pleasure hearing our representative from Bangladesh, as Bangladesh is currently holding the chairship of ADBC's Board of Trustees. Apart from this, we have about 150 staff spread around 10 countries, and ADBC is headquartered here in Bangkok. Our general approach is working through evidence-based approaches to disaster risk reduction and climate resilience, and we are dedicated to address the whole spectrum of issues related to disaster risks, such as risk assessment, preparedness, response capacity, governance, use of technology, and promoting innovations. What is interesting for us in this opportunity here also is, since ADBC works in partnerships, reaching out and identifying additional partners to join up with is an important aspect for us. And that's why I want to quickly go through some of the areas how ADBC is thinking for the work in the coming decade, and share the view of some examples with the view of stimulating some interest and being engaged so we can expand our partnership. We had 20 different sponsoring partners here, and I'm sure we're going to have much more opportunities in the future. So with no further ado, ADBC is, enshrine a set of values that we want to permeate in all of that we do, and they guide us how we prioritize work. And this is important for the approach we have in disaster risk reduction and climate resilience. We firmly believe that everybody can contribute in terms of inclusiveness, and that diversity leads to innovative thought and better performance. And of course, this is central for leaving no one behind. Empowerment, we need to empower our staff, partners, and communities, and particularly vulnerable and marginalized groups. And all people should have a capability to realize their capacity for positive change. Equality, I think we take as a given, but it needs to be promoted, and we embrace gender equality as a fundamental requirement for effective and sustainable solutions. And we also ensure that equality is needed in breaking down the limitations erected by discrimination, and it's a prerequisite for a fair and prosperous future for all. Cooperation, as I mentioned before, we work with partners, and we want to work cooperatively in transdisciplinary teams, and we think that produces better and more relevant results. And then finally, access. Now we're talking about access. We believe it's a fundamental human right, and all people should be afforded equal opportunity and access. Moving on, for the next 10 years, we have a number of strategic priorities. Localization, what do we mean by that? Well, the impacts of disasters are always local, and building the capacity of people and systems to reduce the risk and respond to and recover from the disasters at the local level is a key element in building widespread resilience. Innovation, we need to better address the different disaster risks. You need to use the new technology, but not, as mentioned earlier, not only technologies, but also changes in the social fabric that provides opportunities and do things in new and better ways. The private sector engagement, it's very underused, and there is a lot of resources for mobilization of risk reduction, not just business continuation planning, but also other areas. And over the next decade, we will try to draw on the experience in engaging and expand that. Humanitarian development nexus. I think we're here talking a little bit impinging on what was presented just in the previous presentation. There has over many years been a sort of a split in humanitarian response and issues of sustainable development. And there is a need to bring these elements closer together, and certainly disaster risk reduction falls often in the middle of that area. Regional cooperation, many of the institutes and partners who are partaking and people partaking in this meeting, I don't need to explain why regional cooperation is important, and also transboundary cooperation is an important. I mean, impacts are always local, but there are many disasters that may be geographically widespread, and in some areas, administrative jurisdictions are making things difficult. And then finally, wrapping up on health sector. Of course, there's going to be issues of a post-COVID recovery, but there is also others on the horizon. Heat waves is something that has come up more recently, and the continuation underinvestment in psychosocial support is also evident during the post-COVID recovery areas of that this had not been addressed. Now, how do we do that? Well, we want to have impact. We want to work with partners to scale up, scale out tested and functional and effective systems to reach millions of people. We want to exert some influence in areas of DRR in order to help with setting an effective agenda that will lead to betterment and sustainable futures. And the third I in this area is improvements, and here supporting, whether it's incremental or radical transformative change, improvements are needed, and innovation and support for this is also something. It's not always technology, as mentioned before. Now, some examples. One example I want to present is Asian Preparedness Partnership, which deals with localization, but importantly work with the government, the civil society, and business. Another one I want to touch upon is PEER, and that is the working on the program for enhancement of emergency response. This is a program also that has been ongoing for a long time, and it's being institutionalized in providing the capacities in countries to be able to train, maintain, and have a good response capacity. And Prosper India will touch upon where there's another approach. A good strategy was put in place, and providing assistance in being able to turn that strategy into reality is an important thing. I want to mention about this climate resilience or climate adaptation program, and then wrapping up with some work on where we are promoting gender equality and human rights in disaster risk reduction. We have a couple of other projects also, but I think we're running out of time in this area. So what do I want to mention here? Well, the APP, or the Asian Preparedness Partnership, is a unique multi-sector regional partnership with support from Bill and Melinda Gates and USAID. But it has been established to promote the cooperation and improve the cooperation between local government, local NGOs and civil society, and the private sector, and starting out at response capacity at the local level. It tries to work across several countries, as can be seen here, 6 for the moment. There is maybe a couple of more coming in soon, Laos, PDR, and Bangladesh. And it sees that the localization process is important in the context of that subnational and national humanitarian actors, government, civil society. They need to take a lead role in collaborating on how to plan and implement. It's important to have a partnership rather than, of course, somebody needs to take a responsibility and lead, but others need to have a say in how that is being developed and best implemented. We also see it's very important in support of the World Humanitarian Summit in building capacity at the local level, so more resources can be deployed at the local level to make the response more effective. Moving on, the Program for Enhancement of Emergency Response, or PEER, is a long-term program to strengthen institutional and technical capacity at national and local level. And now we are at the tail end of a project that started in the late 1990s. So 20 years ahead, it's time to institutionalize and focus on this. And here, I think what's important here is that we need to move in and make sure that things are institutionalized and things are built in to be sustainable as we move into the future. This one particularly focuses on the capacities of people to be able to have a good response and being able to ensure that things work properly in coordination at the local level. A slightly different take, but it's similar in a sense, is back in 2015, when the government of Bihar in India, the state of Bihar in India, developed their disaster risk reduction strategy based on the recently agreed Sendai framework. It was an issue about how do you operationalize it. So over the past 4 years, ADBC has been working with the government of Bihar and others on not just looking at how the disaster agencies is going to try to put in place the new strategy, but as it's indicated at the bottom here, you need to work with the disaster management areas of emergency operations centers and others, but also other sectors. And initially the work had been focusing in the agricultural sector when it comes to droughts and agricultural production and floods and etc., and also across in the health sector. So it's important then to make sure that we work across sectors when we do these things. Climate adaptation and resilience for South Asia is another project, and this is an important project. It's trying to move also beyond sectors and working not only, again, in the disaster sector, but the finance, planning, and other areas as well, agriculture, water, etc. And it's an attempt for working practically at the local level in countries, but also having this regional approach and working across South Asia as a whole, focusing in 3 of the countries there. And here I just want to bring in, when we're talking about regional mechanisms, the RCC, or the Regional Consultative Committee, is a mechanism through ADBC. It's part of the charter. But here we're also having an opportunity of using an established mechanism of regional cooperation to go in and support a regional initiative that has been set up. So we don't always have to invent new mechanisms to be able to deal with this at the regional level. And finally, I just want to touch upon one other initiative where we're working on building resilience through inclusive and climate adaptive disaster risk reduction. We're looking at promoting regional cooperation, but also trying to improve resilience and disaster risk reduction methodologies and approaches. And by doing that, making sure that we have an approach that is gender equal and is including human rights approaches or rights-based approaches in disaster risk reduction. Here again, we are leveraging the Regional Consultative Committee for the regional dialogue. We're coming up with practical approaches in this. How do you deal with and improve processes with rights-based approaches? And how do you practically ensure that in the various tools we have gender equal approaches in order to improve disaster risk reduction and climate resilience? So with that, I would like to thank you all. I wish you all a very successful engagement. And I think, as been touched upon by some, there are positive and negative issues of having things online. And I think personally myself, I look forward to when we have meetings in person. But at the same time, I think it's very important that we don't lose the opportunities of having these in-person meetings also online, so others who don't have the opportunity to be there in person can benefit from it, as identified earlier. With that, thank you very much, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Hans, for this again very elaborative presentation. I see many questions, comments, and appreciation in the chat. We don't have much time, and for your information, that we have a technical session 13, which is on circulating ecological sphere and ecosystem. That is possibly tomorrow. So I would like to request the session coordinators, if they are here, Bijon or Rajesh, take note of the questions, and then maybe later you can get an answer from Professor Takeuchi. But I would just like to take one question for Professor Takeuchi here, that there is an interesting question that we have this long-standing policy, institution, and budgetary process, which are the usual process. But to have this type of transformative change, what are the key changes we possibly need, and how we actually overcome those policy, institution, and budgetary process for this type of new model of change? Would you like to elaborate a little bit?
Thank you very much, Dr. Rajeev Shah, for your very important and very good question. And I would like to say that central level governmental structure is a very, very difficult to take a transformative approach. But once you go down to the cities, municipalities, and local governments, and they can, because of the shortage of the resources, they need to deal with several issues at once. And once they could invite other stakeholders, like private sectors and civil societies, as well as the other important stakeholders, as I already mentioned, international institutions or research organizations, and they could establish a very unique organization to promote these ideas. Not just asking to the central or local government to promote these issues, but also we need to further develop our own new type of the organization which could promote this type of the ideas. And very recently, we are now trying to integrate the SDGs future cities with the regional CES concept, as well as the net zero city. Now, more than 90% of the population of the cities in Japan are under the declaration of a net zero by the year 2050. So they are very eager to consider net zero, non-biodiversity loss, achievement of SDGs, voluntary local review for the achievement, and many others. So these are on the same line, and now is a chance for us to integrate rather to take fragmented individual approaches. So it is not so easy, but we are now in a very good position to try to integrate. And we need to further promote this idea, not only in Japan, but also in other parts of the Asia and the Pacific. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Takeuchi. And one very quick question to Hans, if I may. There was a question like you talked about the ADBC's 5 values. So there was a question like how you use these 5 values for making choices for program design and implementation. Maybe very quick response to that.
Yeah, as I said, I mean, the values we have is something that should permeate. So we're doing. So if we just look at one, doesn't mean that everything will be covered with everything we do. But certainly if you look at inclusiveness, that's right up there with leave no one behind. How do we ensure that when we do the program development, that we take a view of ensuring that the people who are going to be positively or negatively affected by some of the work are included. And when we say inclusiveness also, I think it's important to consider that there has to be a meaningful engagement. That doesn't mean that everybody is deciding everything by committee and some people, in some cases you need to have a decision making, but they need to have a open mind in listening, on being able to deal, and in many cases transparently respond why perhaps some issues have not been addressed. So inclusiveness there is really aimed to see, okay, well, can we ensure that our outcomes are better by listening to more voices? At the same time, not diluting perhaps the decision making that in some cases is driven by technology, sometimes driven by science, etc. But opinions can still come in there. So that's one short answer. I can probably elaborate much longer if needed.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think it was a very enriching session. We were a little bit over time, but I think it was worth spending this time and to listen to our esteemed keynote speaker. Once again, thanks Professor Takeuchi and Mr. Hans Gutman for excellent presentation and enriching us with your thoughts and lots of new ideas. Thank you very much. Over to you, Indrajit.
Thank you, Rajeev Sensei, Takeuchi Sensei, and Mr. Hans. It's really wonderful session. And it's a little bit over time, but it's okay. I mean, as Rajeev Sensei mentioned, thank you. Thank you all. Over to Neshma for a few announcements to go to the next. Thank you all.
Thank you so much to a respected moderator, chair, and our keynote speakers. We had a wonderful keynote session 1 for the day, and I'm already very excited for the upcoming parallel sessions and the keynote session that's in line for today.